Many of you have probably heard of Qin Shi Huang of the Qin Dynasty, the first emperor of China. He ended hundreds of years of warfare between rival kingdoms and unified China under a centralized rule for the first time in history. He standardized the writing system, the currency, and even the width of cart axles so that the roads would wear evenly across the entire empire. He imposed a unified legal system, and he also built the foundations of the Great Wall. But you have probably not heard anything about his empress. In fact, if you look up the first empress of China, you will probably see Empress Lu, the first empress of the Han Dynasty. But the Han Dynasty is the second imperial dynasty of China. So what happened to the role of empress in the Qin Dynasty? To be honest, nobody knows for sure. We know that Qin Shi Huang did have many consorts, but none of them were ever named as empress in historical records. But there are some popular theories by modern historians as to why. One theory suggests that Qin Shi Huang had a distrust of women in politics, largely due to what happened with his own mother, and how she was entangled in a political scandal and rebellion early in his reign. Related to this, naming an empress meant elevating her family, and Qin Shi Huang had already seen what powerful families inside the court could do. Others suggest that Qin Shi Huang was relentlessly focused on state and war. There was a lot to do as the first emperor of China after all, and didn't name an empress in order to minimize conflict among his consorts. And finally, in later storytelling, there is one romanticized theory that there was a woman who was Qin Shi Huang's great love, but he was unfortunately unable to name her as empress. And if she couldn't become his empress, then he would rather have no empress at all. That woman was Lady Epang. The story of Epang does not appear in any historical records, but her story has allegedly been passed down throughout Chinese history, through various legends and popular folklore, and adapted to many modern stories. Hi everyone, and welcome to Tea with Amy. Instead of focusing on a historical figure from recorded history, today I will be telling the legend of Epang, based on her popular folklore, along with elements from modern fictional retellings. She was the woman the first emperor of China may have loved, and his empty empress position may have been left for her. We don't know how much of her story is true, or if she was even a real person at all, but her legend is a story that has persisted through time. And perhaps that persistence is its own kind of answer. Before Qin Shi Huang became the first emperor of China, he was a boy who grew up in Handan, the capital city of the kingdom of Zhao during the Warring States period. He was born in 259 BCE to the Prince Yiren and Lady Zhao, and was named Yingzhen. His father, Prince Yiren, was a member of the royal family of the kingdom of Qin, but he was living in the kingdom of Zhao as a political hostage. This was a standard diplomatic arrangement during that time. You sent a son to the enemy court, they send one of theirs to yours. And as long as both sides behave, everyone stays uncomfortable but alive. 1 year before Yingzhen was born, the great Qin general Bai Qi crushed the Zhao army at the Battle of Changping and buried hundreds of thousands of Zhao soldiers alive after they surrendered. Every household in Handan had someone to mourn. Every person on every street had a reason to hate the people of Qin. And right in the middle of that city was a Qin prince and his young son. Not long after, the Qin forces besieged Handan directly. The famous merchant Lu Buwei had been quietly investing in Prince Yiren's political future and needed to keep him safe. And so, he bribed the city guards and arranged an escape. Yiren got out, and he fled back to the kingdom of Qin. But he left his wife and his young son behind. Lady Zhao and young Yingzhen survived by hiding among their relatives. We can only imagine what those years looked like for a child who was old enough to go outside, old enough to understand the expressions on people's faces, and young enough that there was nothing he could do about any of it. The city of Handan did not let him forget what he was. The insults came from doorways, The stones came from alleys. Some days it was just eyes. The particular kind of look that tells you exactly how welcome you are. He learned the things that children in his situation learn, that you do not show hurt, because hurt is an invitation, that the safest thing to appear is dangerous, even when you're small and alone, that the world around him ran on calculation, and the only question was who was doing it. He had a stone he kept with him, flat on one side, sharpened to a point on the other. He never threw it, but he kept it. And it was on exactly one of those days that Epang found him. She was a few years older, the daughter of a local family, someone who has spent her childhood learning which plants healed and which ones harmed. The kind of knowledge passed through watching and doing rather than written down. She has spent most of her life moving through the poorer and harder parts of Handan, bringing that knowledge to people who needed it. She found him near an abandoned temple on the outskirts of the city. He had just been set upon by a group of older children. He was crouched in the shadow of a collapsed shrine, knee torn open by a roof tile, blood soaking through his already dirty trouser leg. He was not crying. He was holding the sharpened stone and waiting to see what came next. She stepped through the weeds, looked at him, looked at the knee, and sat down her basket. That wound needs closing, she said, in a Handan accent, or you'll bleed out before dark. He raised the stone. She did not step back. She looked at him the way she might look at a plant she was trying to identify. She was attentive, but not afraid. Then she crouched down and started going through her basket. She pulled out a few lumps of root that looked a bit like ginger. It was baiji, a plant whose ground paste was known for sealing wounds. She crushed it between two flat stones, the thick, faintly grassy smell of it spreading through the small space between them, and pressed it against his knee before he had fully decided whether to allow it. He kept the stone raised for a moment longer. Then, slowly, he lowered it. The paste was cold against the burning wound. He felt it the way you feel something unexpected, a small shock, and then a kind of relief he did not have a name for. He had been hurt plenty of times in Handan. This was different. This was someone doing something about it. "Why are you doing this?" he said, not quite a question. She tied off the bandages and said simply, "Because it needs doing." He stared at her and said, "I'm Qin." She started packing her basket and replied, "I know what you are. I also know what that is." She nodded at his knee, and that needed doing. Then she reached back into her basket and held out a bundle of dried herbs. "Keep these," she said. "Next time someone gets you, chew them and swallow. You won't cough up blood." She said it as though the next time was simply a fact of life, which, in his life, it was. He sat there in the shadow of the temple long after she had gone, pressing his palm to the wrapped knee, feeling the herb paste cool through the cloth. He kept turning the interaction over, looking for the logic underneath it. In his experience, every act had a price attached. Every kindness wanted something back. He looked for what she had charged him. He could not find it. He did not know what to do with that, so he filed it away somewhere and kept going. Over the years that followed, they met occasionally, near the same temple, out in the fields beyond the city walls where the best plants grew. He learned to tell different herbs apart. She learned that he would accept help if it arrived without ceremony. They did not talk much, but the silence between them was a different kind of silence than the one he lived in everywhere else in Handan. That one was hostile. This one was just quiet. One afternoon, they were sitting on a hillside outside the city, the walls of the Zhao royal palace visible in the distance. And he told her what he planned to do when he got back to the kingdom of Qin. He had thought it through carefully. He would come back with an army. He would find every person who had made his life what it was in the city. He would bury them. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "And then what?" He frowned and said, "Then they're gone." She looked at him and asked, "And your knee will stop hurting?" He shook his head. "That's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" She turned the herb paste in her hands. "You would be doing to others what was done to you." He had no answer for that. She handed him the paste and went back to her work. He understood what she was saying, but he couldn't afford it. For him, softness was not a philosophy. It was a way of getting hurt worse. But the question sat in him, in the place where the answer should have been, and it stayed there for a very long time. When Yingzhen was around 8 years old, another escape was finally arranged, and Lady Zhao and her son were smuggled out of Handan in the dark. In a covered cart, moving through the sleeping city without announcement or farewell. Yingzhen pressed himself against the wooden slats and looked through the gaps at the streets he knew, the alleys, the temple, the hillside. But there was no figure with a basket on her back. The wheels ground through frozen mud. Each turn carried him further from the only place he had ever known, and from the only person in it who had ever done something for him without wanting anything in return. He pressed his hand to his knee. The scar there was smooth, healed more cleanly than it should have been. The one place on his body that had been mended rather than damaged. Returning to the kingdom of Qin did not mean safety. It meant a different and considerably more demanding kind of danger. Yingzhen became king at 13 in 246 BCE when his father died after just 3 years on the throne. His father's old ally, the chancellor Lü Wei, had helped bring Yingzhen's father to power in the first place, and now effectively controlled the court of Qin. Yingzhen spent those early years watching and waiting. He had been studying the hidden logic of people's behavior since he was old enough to leave the house at Handan. Now he applied that same skill to a court full of people who all had their own purposes and who all needed him to be something specific for those purposes to work. Then came the Laowai affair. Lü Wei had arranged for a handsome man named Laowai to enter the household of Yingzhen's mother, the Queen Dowager, disguised as a eunuch. The relationship between Laowai and the Queen Dowager went on for years, even having 2 children together. And then, in 238 BCE, Laowai overreached, staging an outright coup attempt, using the Queen Dowager's seal to mobilize troops against the king. Yingzhen reacted quickly. The coup was crushed. Laowai was killed. The 2 children were killed, and his mother was removed to a secondary palace. Lü Wei was stripped of his titles and sent into exile. But he understood what was coming next for him. A few years later, he chose to drink poison rather than wait for it. To be a young man who had already learned in childhood that the people around you had their own agendas, and then come back to his own court and find his mother, his chancellor, even his half-siblings, all being used as pieces in other people's games. Every relationship that should have been simply there had a calculation underneath it. Every person who should have been safe had turned out, in some way, not to be. He responded by becoming exceptionally good at power, and by deciding that trust was a liability he could not afford to carry. What followed was 9 years of brutal war. The kingdom of Han fell in 230 BCE, and in 228 BCE, when the black banners of the Qin army arrived at Handan in the kingdom of Zhao, he came with them. He went to the old neighborhood. He had people found, Everyone who had been enemies of his mother's family were buried alive. A ledger he had been keeping since he was a small boy finally closed. His eyes moved through the crowd, through the faces of the frightened, the surrendered, the displaced. He was looking for someone else. He found her in the refuge camp set aside for the wounded. She was kneeling in the mud beside an injured soldier, wrapping a wound, giving that same focused attention to the person in front of her that she had always given, as though the city burning around her was simply not the most important thing happening at that moment. Many years had passed. She was not the girl he remembered, but she was still exactly the same. He dismounted. He walked toward her. The crowd pulled back on either side. She did not look up until she had finished tying off the bandage. When she finally raised her eyes, she took a long moment just looking at him, at all of it, at what he had become. Yin Zhen, she said quietly. No one had called him that in years. Something moved in his face that he did not allow to stay. Come back to Xianyang with me, he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. There are the finest physicians there, the finest materials. You will never have to work in a place like this again. She looked past him at the burning city behind his shoulder. Did it work? She asked. He paused. Did what work? Coming back. She gestured very slightly at the army behind him, at the smoke rising over the rooftops. Did your knee stop hurting? It was the same question she had asked him on a hillside all those years ago. He had spent so many years preparing to prove her wrong. Standing here, with all of this behind him, he was no longer entirely certain what he had proved. He extended his hand. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her basket and went with him. She did not look back at the city. She already knew what was there. By 221 BCE, the remaining kingdoms were gone. The kingdom of Wei fell in 225 BCE, Chu in 223, Yan in 222, and finally Qi in 221. The map of the Warring States period was redrawn as something that had never existed before, a single, unified China. Yin Zhen sat with his court and decided that the title of king no longer covered what he had become. He reached back into the mythology of ancient China, combined honorifics of the legendary sage rulers of the Chinese history, into something no one had ever been called, and arrived at a new word, Huangdi, emperor. He declared, I am the first emperor. My successors shall be called the second emperor, third emperor, and so on, in unbroken succession for 10,000 generations. He would be Qin Shi Huangdi, the first August emperor of the Qin Dynasty. Epang came to the powerful court of the Qin Dynasty. She moved through it the same way she had moved through Handan. She did not dress in court silks. She kept her herbs. She had a set of rooms in the quieter interior of the palace that smelled of dried plants. And she kept doing her own work, keeping her own hours, and not particularly noticing who else was in the room. The emperor would frequently visit her, complaining about some administrative frustration, some general who had given him contradictory figures, or some report from a distant territory that made no sense. He carried the weight of the empire into that room, the way a person carries a coat they had been wearing all day and cannot quite figure out how to put down. She listened. She moved between her preparations. She occasionally said something that was not what he wanted to hear. One evening, he said, the road project in the east, 4 separate administrators, 4 separate figures for how close they are to finishing. None of them agree. Without looking up, she asked, which one is lying? I don't know yet, he said, but when I find out, he will be removed and his men reassigned. She was quiet for a moment. She was not thinking about the road project. She turned to look at him and asked, "How long have they been away from home?" He paused and said, "That depends on the project." "Pick one," she said. He named a project and told her how long it had been running. She held his gaze for a moment, then went back to what she was doing and said, "Their families have been waiting for a long time." "The roads cannot wait," he said. "No," she said, "but their families didn't choose the roads." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You have always had something to say about what I build." "I have always had something to say about what it costs," she said. "That is different." He didn't answer. He watched her work. Outside, he was the emperor, but in this room, he was not required to have an answer for everything. It was the only place in the empire where that was true. But there was one question the empire kept asking that even this room could not make go away. He had not appointed an empress. His court understood exactly what that absence meant, and eventually the matter came to a head. Li Si was the chancellor of Qin, and he raised the issue directly to the emperor. "The inner court has no center," Li Si said. "The empress position remains vacant, and the court needs to know the succession is stable." The emperor said nothing, so Li Si continued. "Your Majesty could choose a daughter from any of the former royal houses," Li Si said. "Any one of them will send a message to the empire that the dynasty will last. Any one of them carries political weight that the current arrangement does not." The emperor looked at him and asked, "And if I have my own preference?" Li Si did not hesitate. "The position is not a personal appointment," he said. "It is a function. The woman who holds it must bring something the function requires: bloodline, political alliance, legitimacy in the eyes of the territories we have just absorbed. Without those, the position cannot do its work." The emperor was quiet for a long moment. "You're right," he said. Li Si waited. "That will be all," the emperor said. And the position of empress stayed empty. If he could not fill it with the right person, then he would not fill it at all. The position of empress stayed empty, but empty did not mean resolved. Epang did not attend court sessions. She did not seek influence. She kept to her rooms and her work, the same as she always had. None of that mattered. She was still there. And as long as she was there, the question had an answer the court did not like. Some evenings she could see it on him when he arrived. A tightness around his eyes that had not been there before. He never told her what had been said. She never asked. Then came the books. In 213 BCE, the emperor ordered the destruction of historical records and philosophical texts across the empire. The following year, more than 400 scholars were executed in the capital. He did not come to her rooms the night the burning began. When he came the next evening, she said simply, "I heard." "It was necessary," he said. She did not answer that. Old ideas were being used against present policy, he said. You cannot hold an empire together with the past pulling at it. She looked at him and asked, "What are you afraid of?" "Nothing," he said. "I know," she said, and went back to her work. He stayed longer than usual that evening, saying very little. When he left, he stopped in the doorway. "You think I'm wrong," he said. "I think," she said, "that you're very far from the boy who kept a stone in his pocket." He left without answering. The man who came to her in the evening was still the person she had known. But something had shifted. He had always been driven. Now he was afraid. Not of enemies, not of rebellion, afraid of time. Afraid of dying before his empire was finished. She had known him long enough to see the difference. Before he was building, now he was running. She thought about the pressure from the court to name an empress, and what it cost him every day that she was the reason it was empty. She thought about the scholars and the laborers on the roads and the wall, the ones she had asked about and he had not answered. And she thought about the two versions of him, the one who came to her rooms in the evening and the one who left them, and how much harder it had become to see any distance between them. She had always been practical. That was the most consistent thing about her. From the afternoon in the shadows of a ruined temple to every evening in this room. She looked at what was in front of her and dealt with it. Some stories say that she fell ill, that the years in the palace had taken something from her that she could not get back, and that she went quietly, the way she had done everything. But older legends say that she decided to end it herself, that she did not want to be the reason that was causing him trouble in court, that she did not want to continue to see the suffering of the people, and that she was filled with remorse and sadness at what the man she loved had become. The seat of his Empress would never be filled. He couldn't fill it before, and there is nobody to fill it with now. In 212 BCE, Qin Shi Huang ordered the construction of a new palace complex to begin on the south bank of the Wei River. The name he gave the palace was Epang. According to the records of the Grand Historian, construction began with the front hall of Epang. From east to west, it was 500 paces. From north to south, 115 meters. Above it, it could seat 10,000 people. Below, it could fit banners over 11 meters tall. 700,000 laborers. Timber fell from the deep forests of Sichuan and Hubei, floated down the great rivers and hauled overland through the mountains. A covered, elevated gallery was constructed to span from the palace across the Wei River, connecting directly to the Zhongnan Mountains. It was a corridor to the stars. And the Epang Palace was going to be the first palace under heaven. Legends say that this palace was for her, that in the absence of a title and official position, any acknowledgement the court would have permitted, this was what he could give her. The largest palace complex he had ever built, carrying her name, so that every generation after would speak it when they spoke of what he had built. If the legend is true, then the Epang Palace would be the cruelest gift possible. To honor her name was the kind of suffering she had spent her life trying to relieve. The Tang Dynasty official and poet Du Mu, more than 1,000 years after these events, wrote a famous poem about the palace known as the Rhapsody on the Epang Palace. He was watching the Tang Dynasty court repeat what he considered to be the same mistakes of the past, and he used the fall of Qin Dynasty as a warning. His poem opens by describing the massive cost to build the palace, the end of 6 kings, the joining of 4 seas, and stripping bare the mountains for the Epang Palace to rise. His poem then described the palace's destruction. The rebels rose, the passes fell. Xiang Yu raised the torch and pitied the scorched earth. It is said that the rebel warlord Xiang Yu entered Xianyang in 206 BCE after the fall of the Qin Dynasty. His forces set a fire that burned for 3 months and reduced everything to ash. Du Mu used this scene to try to show how something expensive and difficult to build could be easily destroyed by just one man. The great palace burned, the great empire gone. And he ended the poem with a warning that Chinese scholars have quoted ever since. The people of Qin had no time to lament their own fate. Those who came after lamented it for them, but those who came after lamented it without learning, making those who come after them lament once more. There was just one small problem with the story that Du Mu was telling. In the early 2000s, a team of archaeologists excavated the Epang Palace site in the western outskirts of what is now Xi'an. They were looking for evidence of the burned palace, the remains of the charcoal, the ash, and the scorched ground. But they found nothing. there was no evidence of a large-scale fire at the site at all. In fact, there was barely even evidence of a palace. All that was found was a solid earth foundation, 9 meters high, and nearly half a square kilometer in area. It was solid and carefully constructed, but there was no evidence of an actual palace. No evidence that any substantial building had ever stood on that foundation. The Epang Palace was never completed. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE, just 2 years after the construction of the Epang Palace began. And just as he feared, his great Qin dynasty collapsed just a few years later in 206 BCE. When Xiang Yu set fire to Xianyang, the Epang Palace was still a construction project that history simply ran out of time to finish. Now let's come back to where we started. What happened to the role of Empress in the Qin dynasty? If Lady Epang existed, and she was who the legends say she was, then Qin Shi Huang's love for her could be why he never named an empress. But Epang isn't named in any of the historical records at all. Some people point to vague unnamed consorts in later anecdotal stories, which they believe could be referring to Epang, but there is nothing definitive. Others speculate that Qin Shi Huang may have purposefully kept Epang out of official records in order to protect her. He did live a dangerous life after all, having survived at least 3 assassination attempts. But other historians believe that Epang was never a real person to begin with. They believe that the Epang Palace was not named after a person, and it was instead the other way around, with the fictional Lady Epang named after the palace. In that case, the empty Empress seat remained one of history's real mysteries. The political theories from historians, the distrust of powerful families, the focus on consolidating power, none of them fully explain it. We simply do not know. But many Chinese stories today still want to believe that Epang was real. I guess even with the violent and brutal way that Qin Shi Huang is remembered in Chinese history, we still want to believe that there was someone that he truly loved, who also truly loved him back. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's topic, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.